Hello and welcome. How truly free is the internet? Free to send emails expressing personal opinions, free to search any website you might want to? Well, it depends on where you live, and the battle for control of information has shifted from more conventional methods, such as television, radio, and newspapers, to the cyber world. Monitoring and blocking of websites and blogs, checking of emails, these have all become a part of the equation, with various governments censoring and prosecuting people for expressing their opinions online. A recent study by the OpenNet initiative, which monitors internet censorship, found restrictions in access to political, religious, cultural and sexual information in 25 of the 41 countries it investigated. The organization is a consortium of researchers from different universities in North America and England. Well, don't forget, if you want to talk to us about this subject, we take your phone calls and text messages on this program. The numbers are at the bottom of your screen now. Well, to look at the implications of censorship in cyberspace, we're joined in Toronto by Ronald Diebert, who's a principal investigator for OpenNet and director of the Citizen Lab at the Munk Center for International Studies at the University of Toronto. And joining me here in Washington, D.C. is Morten Sklar, the executive director of the World Organization for Human Rights. And his organization has filed a lawsuit against the internet giant Yahoo for providing information to Chinese authorities that has led to a 10-year prison term sentence for a blogger and a reporter in China, among other similar cases. Gentlemen, welcome both of you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you
for having me.
Well, Dr. Diebert, I want to start with you there in Toronto and just get a very quick perspective on how free the internet really is across the world. I mean, 41 countries investigated, 25 had some kind of control on what you investigated. That sounds like a large proportion.
It is really. When we started the OpenNet initiative in 2002, we were only aware of 2-3 countries that were engaged in internet content filtering practices. But over the years, the reports have increased, and so in the last year, we tested simultaneously in 41 countries, and as you say, we found evidence of content filtering in 25 of them. It wasn't just the number of countries, though, that was alarming. It was really the scope and scale and the sophistication of internet content filtering practices. The type of content that is being targeted for filtering, for example, as you mentioned, political opposition movements, independence movements, human rights information, as opposed to just, I think, what most people expect, which is pornography. States are also targeting services on the internet with increasing precision, and I think this is a reflection in part of the use of advanced commercial filtering software. So the problem is definitely growing, whereas once the internet was largely unfettered, now states are actively intervening to shape and control information to their strategic ends.
I'll ask you more about the filters and so on a little bit later, but let me bring in Morten Sklar here, because your particular case is interesting. You've taken action against Yahoo in effect for what's happened there in China. Take me through that a little bit. Tell me, how is Yahoo operating differently from other companies in China?
We filed the case about a month ago in California under a special U.S. law that allows victims of abuse, of human rights abuses, to bring lawsuits in U.S. courts. What Yahoo did, which was different from some of the other companies involved in this process, is that they provided the names of individual people who had used the internet to communicate about democracy and human rights matters. They broken no laws as far as we consider them, but they had simply exercised their free speech and free press rights, and China wanted to crack down on them for that purpose.
Dr. Diebert, can you see any reason why a government, you mentioned, say, pornography, for example, but can you see any reason why a government could justify filtering or blocking?
Well, of course they could justify it. It happens all the time that they justify it. Usually what happens, however, is that they justify it in terms of blocking access to some catchphrase like culturally sensitive material or pornography, when in fact, if you look closer, if you lift the lid on the internet, you see that they're blocking access to a wide range of content totally unrelated to that, usually having to do with information that's problematic from a political perspective. And I think, moreover, once countries put systems of filtering in place, it's very tempting, especially when there is no accountability or oversight, for those authorities to broaden the scope of content that they want to filter. A good example is Pakistan, which started out by blocking access to imagery offensive to Islam, and then started blocking access to other material. For example, now they block access to any websites related to the Baluch independence movement.
Well, let's get a caller on the line. We have viewers participate in the debate here, and Mehdi's in Spain with a question. Mehdi, go ahead.
Now?
Hi, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah,
Don't
go
you
on.
think the people? Yeah.
Keep going. Just keep going,
That
because there's
the
an echo
people
there.
shut down internet sites which oppose the government, rather than because of freedom of speech.
Okay.
Well, I think I know what he's talking about. He's talking about the issue of whether or not censorship of the internet access, something that, for example, Google does in China, it limits the ability of people to reach sources like democracy and human rights websites, is acceptable. It certainly is more acceptable than giving over people's names that produce a situation where they're imprisoned and tortured. But it's unacceptable from the point of view of international law, because we believe that free speech rights and free press rights countermand the interests of the governments involved to restrict those access.
Well, tell me, Mr. Sklar, specifically about the case of Wang Xiaoning and what he did wrong. What was it that he did wrong in particular that China took offense to?
Wang Xiaoning circulated political discourse, his ideas as a blogger on various democracy and corruption issues. Shi Tao was a reporter in China who did similar things. He sent a dispatch to the United States via the internet, and that was considered to be a violation of a state secret because he revealed the fact that censorship was taking place. Of course, everybody knew that censorship was taking place in any case.
Well, how realistic is it to expect any kind of recourse through the U.S. courts?
The U.S. courts really do provide an alternative mechanism, because it's clear that China was going to prosecute these people. China was not going to provide them with a remedy. The only remedy exists here in the U.S., where, under international law and under U.S. law, these individuals who've been persecuted have the opportunity of filing lawsuits against their abusers, in this case Yahoo, in order to obtain damages and more important to them, to obtain a judgment, a declaration by the court that they were abused by Yahoo.
And you think in this case, Yahoo, and even to some extent Google and its self-censorship, it's a case of chasing the money, trying to be in the lucrative market, and yet at the same time, allowing themselves to be manipulated.
They look at it from the short-term perspective. They want access to those large markets in China. What they're overlooking is that by taking that approach, they're antagonizing not only the United States government, because the United States government hasn't taken kindly to it, but also their own customers, because their customers, their users, are concerned about the loss of their own privacy rights.
Well, let's bring in Dr. Diebert again and just ask about filters, because there's an interesting point you mentioned there, that the filters are getting very sophisticated. Now, I'm assuming that many of those filters are developed and provided by Western companies and then sent to countries that use them.
In fact, all of the filtering software technologies that we found evidence of use in our research were made in the United States. WebSense is used in Yemen, for example. SmartFilter is used in Tunisia, United Arab Emirates, and in some internet service providers in Iran. And Fortinet is used in Burma. In fact, a lot of the attention in this area focuses on the large companies like Google and Microsoft, and that's worthwhile. But I think there's less attention given to these specialized manufacturers of software who basically develop products that are designed to block access to information primarily in business environments, but now they're being marketed to countries that essentially violate human rights. They're developing categories, for example, to block access to advocacy organizations, political opposition movements. The problem with filtering software is that it's, first of all, prone to error. There is a lot of collateral filtering that goes on. So while it is sophisticated on the one hand, it often erroneously blocks whole swaths of content that are totally unrelated to the target content. And also the block lists that are used by these software tools are considered proprietary. So in some countries, like say Tunisia, you don't know what's being blocked because you have a government that is secret about its blocking behavior, and it's using technologies whose block lists are proprietary.
Let me ask you actually, Dr. Diebert, about specifically about the just-in-time filter, which has been used very effectively to limit sort of access to political sites prior to and just after elections. I think Cambodia, Kyrgyzstan, and Belarus were three countries that used them.
Absolutely. Those were the three that we unearthed in our investigations, and I think this is really the horizon here. In many developing countries especially, the internet is really the one source of unfettered independent media for opposition movements because of state control over traditional media, and so it's used to mobilize people. And in the same way that cellular networks and text messages are the means by which political opposition movements can be mobilized. Well, governments are getting savvy to that, and while they may keep the internet relatively unfettered for most of the time, what they are doing is blocking access to information at strategic times, during elections, for example, or leading up to elections, or during public demonstrations. We found this, as you said, in Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, Cambodia. The reports are increasing of this type of what we call just-in-time filtering. It's harder to determine who's behind this type of filtering as well, especially when methods like denial of service attacks are being employed, like we saw, for example, in Estonia recently.
Well, Norway's on the line. David's got a question. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I'm calling from Norway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the question I have is if this is not like interference on the privacy of the people.
Okay.
Yeah, because blocking these programs is like you are trying to limit the human expression, how they feel about the function of the government, that they can freely communicate one-on-one.
Well, David, thank you for that question. I'll get to Morten Sklar on that and use the example of it you're dealing with in China here. David saying, it's blocking the freedom of expression, it's limiting what people can do, and I think that's what we are debating here in the program. And I wonder, how would you suggest then companies strike a balance between being able to do business in a big market that they want to be in, such as China, and then yet still maintaining that dream of free expression that comes with the internet?
I think they have to recognize that they're dealing not only with the laws of China here, which of course are being misused by the Chinese government, but also the laws of the country that they come from, in this case the United States. They have to abide by our requirements that no torture take place, no human rights abuses take place, that the rights of free speech and free press be observed, and also international law, which has similar standards. So they have to look beyond just what they're told to do by the government that's the host country.
Isn't there an irony, though, that what you have in the US is also being investigated, emails being monitored, websites being monitored, and trafficking of traffic across the internet being monitored in the name of, for example, the so-called war on terror? So wouldn't there be a hypocrisy in the US passing judgment on China to some degree?
There is that hypocrisy and the irony that the United States is this very strong supporter of human rights observance in other countries, but we have reached the point, unfortunately, where we have started to violate those same human rights standards, and I must say, using the same excuses that those countries that we've criticized use, namely that they do it for national security reasons.
Let me ask Dr. Diebert, if you can give us examples. Let's look at three regions and ask you how widely monitored emails are. Let's start with a major Western country, then a Middle Eastern country, and then an Asian country. Effectively, if you can give us three examples, how widely is the internet traffic monitored, and especially emails?
Well, I would just concur with what was just said about the United States. There's often a lot of attention about internet police in China monitoring chat rooms, but of course in the United States we have probably the most extensive, without doubt the most extensive surveillance system, and there were recent cases where the Bush administration authorized extra-legal wiretaps that were put in place at key juncture points for telephone traffic, for email traffic, and so on. So surveillance is widespread, and it's certainly nothing new in the United States and in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, for example. If you move to the Middle East, countries there we found are targeting a lot of information for filtering having to do with political opposition movements, cultural material, internet tools that are used by people to secure their traffic and get around these filters and choke points. In Asia, of course, you have China, which is leading the pack to some extent, but there are many countries that are following its lead. Thailand, for example, after the coup especially, many more websites are being filtered in that country. Burma, of course, Vietnam, North Korea. Really, this is a global problem. I think it's really changing the character of the internet. We used to take the internet for granted as this seamless, global, forum for free expression and access to information. Well, what's been happening over the last 5 years is states are actively intervening, carving up, corralling, and militarizing this environment to the point where it's really beginning to degrade it. We talk about problems having to do with global environmental degradation. Well, there's degradation of the global communications environment going on.
Well, let's get a quick question from Alexander, who's in St. Petersburg. Nice to hear from Russia. Go ahead, Alexander.
My question is that I call you from Russia, and we in Russia we were shocked when Estonian government made a decision to move the monument for the victims of the Second World War to another place, to the shadow, or so on. But anyway, my question is that officially, openly, in the moment of these protests, Estonian government, member of European Union, officially used filters so that Russian people from Russia could not put comments, could not communicate with their friends and simply with the websites in Estonia.
Alexander, I'll use that example and get to Morten Sklar here and just ask, I mean, so what we're seeing in China is not unusual, really. I know you're tackling the issue of China in your particular case, but it's not something that's unusual. This is, as Dr. Diebert has said, going to get a lot wider.
I think what's unusual in what we see in China, though, is the substantial and very direct role that the United States corporations are playing in that process. In other words, it's not just a governmental issue of the abuses that the government imposes, but it's the fact that U.S. corporations are going along with that practice.
Thank you, Morten Sklar and Dr. Ronald Diebert, and thank you for being with us. On the next show, we look at the deteriorating situation between Hamas and Fatah in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Is the violence destroying the hope for a secure Palestinian future? Send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. Street Talk's coming up next.